Boone Maddox was the kind of man who'd shoot before speaking, until the morning he found a crying baby on the saloon steps. What he did next made the whole town forget what they thought they knew about him. Boone Maddox wasn't a man known for tenderness. Folks said he came out of the womb scowling, fist already clenched like he meant to fight the world. He drank hard, fought harder, and had a reputation for shooting first and grunting later. So when the Red Lantern's doors flew open that morning, most expected to see him stumbling toward the trough to wash the whiskey out of his beard. But instead, he stood there, squinting down at something small and strange wrapped in a worn quilt with faded blue flowers, its edges dusted in grit. The crying came steady, sharp, like it wasn't just a baby's wail but a protest against being left in a world like this. Boone didn't move right away. Just stood with his boots planted wide, and his hand twitching near the pistol at his hip, like the bundle might explode. One of the stable boys peeked around the corner, saw the scene, and ducked back quick, whispering to another boy, "Boone's found a ghost." But this wasn't no ghost. It was flesh and blood, red-faced and wailing, arms flapping like a baby bird fallen from the nest. Boone crouched slowly, joints cracking like old floorboards, and reached out one gloved hand to nudge the blanket aside. What he saw hit him like a sucker punch. The baby was scrawny, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes squeezed shut, with the kind of helpless fury only the newly born carry. She had a little tuft of dark hair curling damp against her forehead, and one tiny fist tangled in the frayed edge of the quilt. Boone blinked, then muttered a curse so low it got swallowed by the breeze. Behind him, Miss Lottie leaned out the saloon door, one hand resting on the frame, her silk robe slipping off one shoulder. She saw the baby, saw Boone's expression, and said softly, "Someone didn't want her." Boone turned his head just slightly. Then they should have left her in a church, not on whiskey-soaked planks. Lottie sighed, lighting a cigarette with fingers that trembled a little. "Church is 3 towns over. We're all that's open at this hour." Boone looked back at the baby. She'd stopped crying for a moment, mouth parted in a silent sob like she'd worn herself out. The sight of it did something to him he didn't understand. He didn't believe in God, not since the war, and he sure as hell didn't believe in fate. But something about that child lying there on the edge of sunrise and filth made him feel like he'd been cornered by something bigger than chance. He looked around, like maybe someone else would step in, some passing woman or wandering preacher, but the street was empty except for a one-legged dog and the faint rustle of tumbleweed. Boone rubbed his jaw, his palm rasping against days of stubble, and finally muttered, "Hell." Then, almost awkwardly, he scooped the baby up in his arms. She weighed next to nothing, but the feel of her against his chest made him feel like he was holding a stick of lit dynamite. The blanket shifted, and she let out a little sigh, nestling into the crook of his elbow like it was the most natural thing in the world. Boone stood there for a long moment, the town still and watching from behind, cracked shutters and dusty windows, as if holding its breath. Miss Lottie blew out a stream of smoke and said, "What you gonna do now, Boone Maddox?" He looked down at the baby, then back up at her, and said with a voice like gravel, "Damned if I know." Then he turned and stepped back inside the saloon, carrying the child like something he'd never meant to find but wasn't ready to let go of either. Boone Maddox had lived his life by simple rules: keep your back to the wall, your boots dry, and your heart colder than the whiskey in your glass. He'd ridden through wars, watched men cry out for mothers they hadn't spoken to in decades, buried friends without blinking, and pulled the trigger more times than he could count. What he'd never done was hold something as small and breakable as a baby. The saloon was quiet when he stepped back in, just the low creak of floorboards and the distant clink of a bottle settling behind the bar. He hadn't even realized the music had stopped, or maybe it never started that morning. Either way, all Boone could hear now was the soft snuffling from the bundle in his arms. She'd stopped crying, worn out probably, her tiny face pressed against his vest, breathing warm and slow. He didn't look down at her, not really. He just stood in the center of the room, unsure what the hell came next. Miss Lottie was already lighting the lamps, though the sun had just started rising outside. Her silk robe trailed across the floor, and her painted face looked softer without the dim glow of nighttime shadows. She poured a cup of coffee and set it on the nearest table without asking. Boone didn't touch it. "You gonna keep holding her like that all day?" she asked gently. Boone grunted. "I was thinking of tossing her back out." Lottie raised an eyebrow. "She's not a sack of potatoes, Boone." "She's not mine either." "Well, she sure as hell ain't mine," Lottie said, her voice still calm but sharp around the edges. "And last I checked, the sheriff's out fixing a broken axle 20 miles north. Ain't nobody else here gonna take her." Boone didn't answer. He wanted to argue, but his throat felt tight and his tongue refused to cooperate. He hated babies. Hated the way they wailed without reason, needed things he didn't know how to give, looked at you with big, trusting eyes like they hadn't figured out the world was cruel yet. It made him uncomfortable. Like they expected something he didn't have. He moved toward the stairs, the baby still cradled awkwardly in his arms, her head lolling just a little. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that standing there like a statue wasn't helping. Lottie followed him to the bottom step. "I'll find her a place," Boone muttered. "Someone out of town. A widow, maybe. She ain't gonna stay with me." Lottie leaned against the banister, sipping her coffee slow. "Sure," she said. "You do that." But Boone didn't go to the stables, didn't ride out toward any widow or orphanage. Instead, he climbed the stairs to the small room he rented above the saloon, the one with a cot, a trunk, and not much else. He laid the baby on his bed like she was made of glass and stepped back, arms crossed, heart thudding like he just walked into a gunfight. She blinked up at him, quiet, calm, her eyes wide and curious, the color of creek water after rain. Boone stared at her like he might figure out a way to disappear if he just held still long enough. Then she hiccuped, a soft, ridiculous sound that made his chest twitch. She sneezed next, loud for someone so small, and Boone cursed under his breath and grabbed an old shirt from the trunk, folding it into a makeshift blanket and tucking it under her head. "I ain't no nursemaid," he told her firmly. "Don't get any ideas." She blinked again, yawned, and closed her eyes. Boone turned, sat heavily in the chair beside the bed, and leaned back with a sigh that felt too full of years. He didn't know her name, didn't want to. Didn't want to get used to the smell of her or the way she curled her hands into tiny fists like she was ready to fight the world too, but something in his gut said he already was. Boone didn't notice the note at first, not until the blanket slipped while he was trying to figure out how to swaddle her better than a sack of beans. A corner of crumpled paper poked out from between the folds, stained and soft from damp air. He tugged it free with 2 fingers, unfolded it slow, and stared at the slanted handwriting. "Her name is Willa. Please don't let her die." That was it. No name, no explanation, no promise to return. Just a plea scratched in a shaky hand that made Boone's gut twist in a way he didn't like. He read it again, then looked at the baby curled on his bed, her little fist still tucked close to her chest. Willa. It suited her more than he wanted to admit. He folded the note, shoved it in his coat pocket, and muttered, "Well, hell." Then he scooped her up, blanket and all, and stormed down the stairs like he had a job to do. The sun had fully broken over Larkspur Bend now, casting long shadows from the buildings and setting the dust aglow. Boone crossed the street in 3 long strides, headed straight for the whitewashed chapel that leaned a little to the left like it had given up standing proud years ago. The preacher, an old man with shaking hands and watery eyes, stepped out as Boone pounded on the door. "Can't you take her?" Boone barked, holding Willa out like an unwanted parcel. "You're always preaching about charity and God's mercy." The preacher blinked at the baby, looked at Boone, then said, "Son, I live in a room behind the altar with nothing but a cot and a Bible. I ain't got the means." Boone cursed under his breath and turned on his heel. Next stop was the general store, where Miss Bet was sweeping the porch, her graying hair twisted up in a bun so tight it could hold secrets. She saw him coming and stepped back, arms folded. "Don't even try it," she said before he opened his mouth. "She needs a woman," Boone growled. "Someone who knows what babies eat and how to stop 'em from screaming." Miss Bet glanced at Willa, then said, "I've raised 8 of my own. I'm not starting over now." Boone didn't reply, just spat into the dust and moved on. By the time he reached the jailhouse, his patience was worn to threadbare. Sheriff Cole was leaning back in his chair, boots on the desk, hat tilted low to block the sun. Boone kicked the doorframe and held Willa up. "She ain't mine." Cole lifted his hat just enough to see the baby, then grinned. "Didn't say she was, but you're the one carrying her around like she's yours." Boone's jaw twitched. "You want her?" Cole shook his head, still smirking. "Nope." Boone stepped forward, towering. "You're the law. Ain't there some place you can send her? Some orphanage or church outfit?" "Nearest orphanage is a week's ride, and she wouldn't last a day in a wagon." Cole stood, stretched, and walked over to the window. "Looks like she's yours now, Boone." Boone didn't argue, didn't yell, just stared at the sheriff like he was weighing whether it'd be worth the jail time to throw him through the window. Then Willa started to cry again. Soft at first, then louder, her face scrunched and red. Cole added, still watching the street, "You know, for a man who don't like people, you sure are carrying one around an awful lot." Boone turned and walked out, the door swinging behind him. Back at the saloon, Miss Lottie had already set out a little bottle with goat milk and a spoon, her way of saying she knew he wasn't done trying. Boone sat at his usual table, bottle in one hand, Willa in the other, trying to coax her to drink. She fussed, but latched eventually, and Boone leaned back with a tired breath, staring down at her face. "Willa," he said out loud, testing the name like a gun he hadn't fired yet. "Ain't no reason for you to be here, is there?" She looked up, eyes blinking slow, and for just a second Boone swore she smiled. He didn't smile back, but he didn't look away either. Boone Maddox had never rocked anything to sleep in his life except a pistol back into its holster. But now, in a room that smelled of old tobacco and saddle oil, he sat hunched in a chair that groaned louder than the baby, trying to make sense of something softer than a gun and louder than a storm. He'd started with what he had, an old whiskey bottle from under the cot, rinsed out twice and rubbed clean with a rag. Then he'd taken a square of flannel from the pile of worn clothes Miss Lottie had pressed into his hands without a word, folded it into a kind of cushion, and jammed it into the neck of the bottle. The hole he'd cut in the cork was too big at first. Milk sprayed out like a fountain and hit him square in the beard, but he adjusted, muttered something foul, and kept at it until it dribbled just right. Willa didn't complain. She latched on with the ferocity that startled him, her little hands gripping his finger like she meant to keep him there. Boone held the bottle awkwardly, fingers stiff, shoulders tense like he was waiting for something to go wrong. But she drank, cheeks puffing out with each gulp, and he watched, half in awe, half in horror, that this tiny creature needed him to keep her alive. He burped her over his knee, once, twice. Then she screamed like he'd pinched her. Boone rocked her gently, boots planted wide on the floor, the chair creaking with every sway. He didn't sing, Boone didn't sing, but his curses came slower now, softened at the edges, drawn out in a low rumble that almost sounded like a song. The room was lit by a single oil lamp that threw long shadows against the walls, and outside, the town had gone still again, like it was holding its breath. Willa snuffled, then hiccuped, then let out a small belch that made Boone grunt with surprise. He dabbed her mouth with the edge of his sleeve and stared down at her, uncertain if he should be proud or alarmed. His cot was too small for the two of them, but he couldn't bring himself to put her on the floor, not even with blankets. He rolled out his bedroll instead, laid her in the center, surrounded her with pillows like a fort, and sat cross-legged beside her. She stared up at him, blue eyes wide, her fingers curling and uncurling in the lamplight. Boone rubbed his temples. "I ain't cut out for this," he said under his breath. "Ain't never been no kind of soft." But the baby blinked slow and yawned, and something in his chest pulled tight. He watched her drift off, her tiny chest rising and falling like the desert wind, and for a long time, Boone didn't move. He just sat there on the floor, knees stiff, back aching, watching over something that didn't belong to him but somehow felt like it did. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if someone would come for her, or if he'd find the strength to ride away. But tonight, he'd fed her, held her, kept her warm. And for a man like Boone Maddox, that was something close to a miracle. The Red Lantern Saloon carried a stink that clung to its walls like old regrets, spilled beer, smoke, unwashed men, and too many years of sorrow soaked into wood. Boone Maddox fit right in. He always had. His coat smelled of saddle leather and sweat, his boots tracked in dust, and there was a line of dried blood on his shirt sleeve from a bar fight 3 nights back that he hadn't bothered to clean. He was a man carved out of the land, worn at the edges, rough in all the places life had hit hardest. But when he held Willa, none of that seemed to matter. She should have cried, the way other babies did when strangers picked them up, noses wrinkled at smells they didn't understand, eyes wide with confusion. But not her. She went quiet when Boone scooped her into the crook of his arm, like his chest was the only place she remembered how to breathe. Lottie noticed it first. She was wiping down the bar, watching Boone try to rock Willa while also balancing a poker chip on the edge of his boot for some reason he couldn't explain. The baby had hiccuped once, then let out a wail that rattled the rafters. "Try lavender oil," Lottie called out, not looking up from the glass she was drying. Boone blinked. "Try what?" "Lavender. For colic. My aunt used it on every babe she ever rocked to sleep. Rub it on her feet, calms 'em right down." Boone stared at her like she'd just suggested whiskey for teething. But when Willa started squirming again, fists flailing, that little face turning red like a sunrise, he muttered something under his breath and stood up. He found the bottle of oil where Lottie had left it on the shelf beside a cracked mirror and a jar of licorice sticks. The glass was small, the cork stopper chipped, but the scent hit him quick, sweet and strange, like the desert after rain. He turned it over in his hand like it might bite him, then shuffled back to the table where Willa lay bundled in one of Lottie's old shawls. He sat down slow, knees popping, and reached for her foot with fingers better suited for pulling triggers than baby toes. She didn't cry when he touched her, just blinked up at him, calm and curious. He pulled off the blanket a little, baring one tiny foot no bigger than his thumb. He poured a single drop of oil into his palm, rubbed his hands together until the scent filled the air, and then carefully, clumsily, began to massage it into her skin. It was awkward. His fingers were too big, too calloused, and at one point he used a little too much pressure and she kicked at him. He scowled, muttered another curse, and tried again with a gentler touch. Her toes curled. She let out a soft sound, not a cry, not a laugh either, something in between. A coo, soft and sweet, like a bird waking up. Boone froze. Then, slowly, very slowly, he rubbed again. A little more careful this time. She didn't flinch. Her legs went still. Her eyelids fluttered like she was fighting sleep. "Well, I'll be," he said, almost to himself. Willa gave a sigh. One of those deep baby sighs that seemed to drain the whole weight of the world from her tiny chest. She went limp in his arms, her head resting near his elbow, lips parting just enough to show the edge of her tongue. Boone kept rubbing her foot, not because he thought she needed it, but because he didn't want to stop. Gun oil and lavender, that's what the saloon smelled like now. That's what he smelled like now. He could feel it clinging to his skin, the strange mix of war and peace, blood and bloom, like two lives crashing into each other and settling into something new. Boone sat back in the chair, Willa curled in his arms, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like breaking something just to hear it crack. He just sat, breathing slow, watching the baby sleep, his hands still warm from the oil, and though he never said it aloud, deep down he knew something in him was changing, something he wasn't sure he could ever undo. The letter came in on the noon stage, tucked between a shipment of canned peaches and a box of gun oil addressed to the sheriff. It was folded neat, sealed tight, and pressed with a smear of wax already cracked at the edges. Boone wouldn't have paid it no mind except for the handwriting, slanted just so, like it had always leaned toward the truth, whether it wanted to or not. The name on the front stopped him cold. His own, spelled right. No extra flourish, just Boone Maddox, as if written by someone who didn't have time for lies anymore. He didn't open it at first, just held it in his hand, thick fingers curling around the paper like it might vanish if he looked away. Lottie watched from behind the bar, polishing glasses that didn't need polishing, her eyes flicking toward him now and then but never settling too long. Willa was asleep upstairs, wrapped in the lavender shawl, her breath soft as cotton against the window glass. Boone tucked the letter into his coat and didn't say a word. That night, long after the lamps had been dimmed and the music died out, Boone sat at the corner table near the back, the place where no one else dared sit. He pulled out the letter, cracked the seal with a thumb, and unfolded it slow, like a man unwrapping a wound. It was from her, Clara Bishop, the woman he had once loved with a fire that burned too fast and ended in ashes. He hadn't seen her in nearly 5 years, not since Wichita, not since that mess with her father's debt and the bounty that landed Boone on the run. He'd left her crying in the street, a ring still in his coat pocket, and no good reason for the way he vanished. She had written once, maybe twice after that, but he never answered. Some things, he'd told himself, were better left buried. But here she was again, her words stretched across the page in that same steady hand. Her name is Willa. I didn't know who else to turn to. I can't keep her safe, Boone. Not where I am. Maybe I never could. But you know how to fight. And you once knew how to love. Please take care of her. If you ever cared for me at all, don't let her end up like I did. There was no return address. Just that one plea, written like a final breath, soaked into the paper like sweat into a collar. Boone stared at it for a long time, eyes burning, fists clenched. Around him, the saloon stayed silent, the usual whispers and dice rolls fading into something still and heavy. No one asked what the letter said. Maybe they saw the way he didn't move after reading it. Maybe they knew better. He stood finally, folding the letter slow, tucking it back inside his coat like it was made of glass. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying grit through the alleys and stirring up the dust that settled in every crack of this tired little town. Boone stepped out into it, his boots crunching over the boards, his shadow stretched long across the dirt. The past had always been behind him, but now it was ahead too, blowing toward him like a storm that wouldn't be outrun. And in the room above the saloon, a baby named Willa slept through it all, unaware that the blood in her veins carried a weight neither of them had asked for. Boone lit a cigarette with a shaking hand and stared out at the horizon, knowing something had shifted, something big. He could feel it coming, and this time, he wasn't sure he could shoot his way out. The stranger came in at sunset, riding a black gelding with a limp and a saddle that had seen better decades. Dust coated his boots, his coat, even the brim of his hat, but his eyes were sharp as razors and just as cold. Folks in Larkspur Bend didn't much like men who smiled too easily, and this one wore a grin like it had been carved into his face with a dull knife. Boone Maddox saw him from the saloon window, watched him dismount slow, and tie his horse like a man with no hurry in him. That was the first sign. Trouble never ran. It walked. He stepped into the Red Lantern without knocking, without wiping his boots, without even glancing at the piano where Gus was plunking out a lazy tune. The music stopped anyway, dying under the weight of silence. Boone didn't stand, just leaned back in his chair, one hand on the bottle, the other resting on his thigh near the revolver. He didn't bother to hide. The stranger tipped his hat, eyes flicking around the room until they landed on Boone. "Heard there's a baby here," he said, voice smooth like a river stone. "Goes by the name Willa." The words settled like dust over the crowd. Boone didn't blink. "Plenty of babies in the world," he said. "Ain't none of your business what they're called." The man smiled wider, pulled a folded paper from his coat, and laid it on the table like a card in a poker hand. Boone didn't reach for it. Didn't need to. He could already see the faint print, the government seal, the word "wanted" in faded ink. Only this time, it wasn't his face. It was the face of a man he once knew in Texas. A rancher named Grant Hollis. Rich, land-owning, cruel to horses and worse to women. Dead now, apparently. No wife, no sons. But a whisper had spread that he'd fathered a daughter out of wedlock. An heir no one wanted to claim, but everyone wanted to find. "She's blood," the man said quietly. "His blood. That makes her worth something. More than you're used to, I reckon." Boone spat at the stranger's boots. "Ain't for sale." The man's smile twitched, just slightly. "I don't buy babies, Mr. Maddox. I retrieve them. For folks who pay well." Boone stood then, slow and steady, his boots loud against the floorboards. "I told you to leave." The man didn't move. "You really think a saloon is any place to raise a child?" Boone's voice dropped, low and even. "You really think you're walking out of here if you take another step toward that stairwell?" The man held his ground for a moment, then tucked the paper back into his coat and tipped his hat once more. "I'll be at the livery," he said, "just in case you change your mind." Boone watched him go, shoulders tight, jaw locked. Around him the saloon buzzed again, voices low, glasses clinking. But the air had changed. Boone didn't sit back down. He turned, climbed the stairs 2 at a time, and opened the door to his room. Willa was asleep on the cot, one arm thrown above her head, her tiny chest rising and falling, like nothing in the world could touch her. Boone sat beside her, laid a hand over the blanket, and stared at the wall. His mind wasn't on the bounty, or the ranch, or the money. It was on the way that man smiled, like he already knew the ending. But Boone wasn't ready to let someone else write it. Not this time. Not for her. The moon hung low over Larkspur Bend, pale and watchful, casting long silver shadows over the barn behind the red lantern. Most folks were drunk or asleep by then, curled up in their corners of the world, dreaming of things they'd never have. But Boone wasn't sleeping. He'd been sitting at the window upstairs, a rifle across his lap, one ear tuned to the stillness of night, the kind of stillness that didn't last. He'd moved Willa to the barn that evening, not because he didn't trust his room, but because the wind had picked up and she seemed to sleep better in the smell of hay and horse. He'd made a cradle from an apple crate, lined it with wool and one of Lottie's old quilts, tucked her inside and sat with her until her breathing went soft and slow. Then he locked the barn door and waited. The man had said he'd be waiting at the livery, but Boone knew better. Men like that didn't wait. They crept. The first sound was soft, a crunch of dry grass under a boot. Boone was already moving. He stepped out from the back of the saloon, keeping low, sticking to the shadows. The barn loomed ahead, dark and silent, except for the faint creak of a hinge. Boone's jaw tightened. He rounded the corner just as the stranger reached for the latch. Boone didn't speak, just pulled his revolver from the holster, the metal catching moonlight as he raised it. The bounty man froze. His hand hovered near his coat, but Boone could see it, the twitch, the readiness, the gleam in his eyes that said he hadn't come for words. It happened fast. The man turned, drawing a knife from his belt. Boone fired, but the shot missed, clipped the doorframe with a splintering crack. The knife flashed, slicing across Boone's forearm, hot and deep. He stumbled back, cursing, then lunged forward with a grunt, slamming the man against the wall of the barn. They grappled in the dirt, fists and elbows, knees driving into ribs. No elegance, no fancy moves, just rage and grit. Boone took a punch to the gut, hard enough to knock the wind from him, but he came back swinging, caught the man in the jaw with a hook that sent teeth flying into the hay. The knife came up again, grazed Boone's neck, just shallow enough to sting. Boone roared and drove his boot into the man's shin, then threw his weight forward, slamming him to the ground. The gun had fallen somewhere. Boone didn't need it. He wrapped his hands around the man's throat, face close enough to see the fear leaking into his eyes. The man fought, but Boone had the strength of something old and burning, something that came from deep down where memories lived. He thought of Clara, of the letter, of Willa breathing in the hay just yards away. When the man stopped struggling, Boone let go. He stood slowly, breathing hard, blood running warm down his arm. The night was quiet again. The fight had stolen the silence, but now it was back, heavier than before. Boone looked down at the man's body, then looked away. He limped into the barn, found Willa still asleep in her crate, her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. He knelt beside her, cradling his arm, and watched her for a long time. Outside, the moon watched too. And in the dirt behind the stable, the past lay still, finally out of breath. The morning came slow, stained in shades of rust and gold, the sky stretching wide over Larkspur Bend like a tired old blanket. Boone didn't wait for the sun to fully rise. He dug the grave behind the barn with an old spade, the dirt hard and stubborn, full of rocks that jarred his shoulder with every strike. His arm throbbed from the knife wound, bandaged in rough cloth, the blood already soaking through, but he didn't stop, didn't say a word, just kept digging until the hole was deep enough to hold the trouble that had come slinking into his life under a false smile. The bounty hunter's body lay off to the side, wrapped in canvas from the livery, face covered. Boone didn't look at it. He didn't light a fire, didn't speak any words. The man had come to take something precious, something Boone hadn't known was his until the moment he nearly lost it. That was enough of a eulogy. He rolled the body in, shoveled dirt over it, packed it down tight. When it was done, he leaned on the shovel, breathing heavy, sweat stinging his eyes. The wind moved through the trees above, and for the first time, in a long while, Boone felt the land settle. Not forgive, just accept. By noon, he was back inside the barn, the smell of hay and horse thick in the air. Willa was awake, blinking at the world with her slow, serious eyes. She didn't cry much anymore, just watched, like she was memorizing everything. Boone nodded at her, then looked over at the pile of pine planks he'd gathered near the wall. He'd picked them out from the lumber yard earlier that week, thinking maybe he'd fix the saloon's back steps. Now he had something else in mind. He set to work with a handsaw and chisel, smoothing the wood with care he didn't know he had. His hands were rough, the skin cracked, but he worked slow, pausing when Willa fussed, feeding her with the bottle Miss Lottie had cleaned and warmed. He spoke to her now when he worked, his voice low and gravelly, telling her what he was doing, how the cradle would be strong and wide, with slats carved smooth and corners rounded. She cooed once when he said her name. He smiled at that, without thinking. By evening, the cradle was finished, sanded down and lined with soft cloth. He'd carved her name into the headboard, Willa, letters deep and even, like they belonged there. He stared at it for a long moment, then placed her gently inside. She looked up at him, fingers curling near her chin, a bubble forming at the corner of her mouth. Miss Lottie leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, a lit cigarette in one hand. She took a drag, blew out smoke, and said, "You're softening, Boone." He didn't look up, just adjusted the blanket around Willa and muttered, "Maybe." Lottie took another puff, then flicked the ash toward the dirt. "Ain't a bad thing, you know." Boone nodded once, still not meeting her eye. Later, he sat at the table upstairs in his room, a candle flickering beside a leather-bound journal he'd found tucked in his old saddlebag. He opened it to the first page. The paper yellowed at the edges, and began to write. "Fed her at sunrise. Took 2 ounces. Smiled when she saw the horse out the window. Sounded almost like a laugh." He paused, then kept going. The words came slow, uneven, but they came. And as they filled the page, Boone Maddox, gunslinger, loner, man of few words, began to tell the story of the girl who wouldn't be left again. Boone heard it first from the boy who swept out the jail, ran up breathless, hat in hand, dirt on his face and fear in his eyes. "Marshall's coming," he said between gasps. "Coming fast. And he's asking for you by name." Boone didn't say a word, just nodded once, turned back toward the saloon, and lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. Sheriff Cole met him in the middle of the road not long after, spurs jangling, jaw set. "Didn't have a choice," he said low. "Letter came down from Wichita. Somebody filed a report, said you killed a man behind the stable, left no name, but the marshal's been itching for a reason to come sniffing around Larkspur anyway." Boone didn't flinch. "I buried a bounty hunter who came to steal a child. That a crime now?" Cole scratched his beard. "Depends on who's asking. You know how these marshals are. They ain't looking for the truth. They're looking for a story that fits in a courthouse." By nightfall, word had spread. The town that had once looked at Boone like he was a rabid dog now looked again, and what they saw depended on what they believed. Some folks said he was still a killer, same as always, hiding behind a baby to clean up his name. Others said he'd changed, that something had softened in him, something that didn't come from whiskey or time. The saloon girls were the first to speak out. Lottie gathered them near the bar and said, "He feeds her himself, sings when he thinks no one's listening, and built that cradle with his own hands. That ain't a killer. That's a man trying." The blacksmith stood up next, a big man with a busted knee and a quiet voice. "Boone helped me last week with the wagon axle. Didn't ask for a thing. Just said it looked like I needed a hand. Folks don't change overnight, but maybe he's trying." Then came Miss Ruth, the school teacher with ink on her fingers and a spine of steel. She'd once told her class Boone was what happened when boys grew up without guidance. Now she stood in front of the saloon and said, "I was wrong. He watches that girl like she's the last piece of good in him." The marshal rode in the next morning, dusty, grim, eyes like burnt coal. He wore the badge heavy on his chest and didn't smile when folks waved. He went straight to the sheriff's office, took a seat, and said, "Bring him." Boone walked in without chains. Cole offered them, but Boone had shaken his head. "If I need 'em, I'll wear 'em." The marshal looked him over. "You Boone, Maddox?" "I am." "You kill a man 2 weeks back? Buried him behind the barn?" "I did." "Why?" "He was going to take the child." The marshal narrowed his eyes. "That child yours?" "No," Boone said, voice steady. "But she's mine to protect." Outside, the town gathered, waiting for the sound of gunfire or boots stomping through dust. But nothing came. Minutes passed. Then more. Finally, the marshal stepped outside, looked at the faces staring back at him, and said, "Ain't a man alive who wouldn't do the same. Far as I'm concerned, we're done here." The town exhaled, like it had been holding its breath for a year. Boone didn't smile, just walked back toward the saloon, Willa in his arms, her cheek pressed to his shirt, her breath warm against his neck. People stepped aside as he passed, not out of fear, but respect. Not everyone believed he'd changed, but enough did, and sometimes that was all a man needed. The trial was held under the open sky, just beyond the edge of Larkspur Bend, where the land stretched out flat and quiet, the kind of place where truth couldn't hide and lies didn't echo. There was no courthouse, no jury box, just a wagon turned sideways to serve as a bench and an old wooden chair for the judge who'd ridden in from Junction to see it through. Folks gathered early, whispers circling like vultures. Some came out of curiosity, some to see Boone Maddox finally answer for a life full of blood and silence, and some because they wanted to believe in what they'd seen lately, a man trying to change. Boone stood with his shoulders straight, hands by his side, hat in one hand and his heart in the other. He didn't wear anything different. Still had the same worn boots, the same gun belt slung low on his hip. The sun was already hot, baking the back of his neck, but he didn't flinch. Sheriff Cole stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd. Miss Lottie sat on a crate in the front row, holding Willa in her lap, the child squirming against the heat but quiet. The judge cleared his throat. "You know why you're here, Mr. Maddox?" Boone nodded once. "Yes, sir." "You admit to killing the man found buried behind the stable?" "I do." "Without trial, without warrant?" Boone looked out past the crowd, toward the barn where he'd fed Willa her first bottle, toward the sky that had watched him become something new without telling him how. "He came to take her. A baby. Said she was worth money. I told him to leave. He didn't. He pulled a knife. I did what I had to." The judge leaned back in the wagon seat, arms resting on his knees. "And this child, Willa, she yours by blood?" "No," Boone said, his voice rough but steady, "but she's mine now." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some folks nodded, others just stared. "I never meant to raise a child," Boone went on. "Didn't think I could. Hell, most days I still don't. But I feed her. I hold her when she cries. I built her a cradle with my own hands. I read her that old Bible book I once used to steady a broken table. I've done more right by her than I ever did by anyone in my whole life." The judge was quiet. Dust swirled at his feet. A hawk called high above, circling wide. Then Willa, restless and barefoot, wriggled out of Lottie's arms, and toddled across the dirt. The crowd parted without thinking. She stumbled once, caught herself, then reached Boone, and tugged on the leg of his trousers. He looked down, startled, and she looked up with those steady eyes, and said it clear as a bell, "Dada." No one moved. Not the judge, not Cole, not the dozens of neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid Boone's shadow. They all just stood there, caught between the weight of the past and the pull of something new. Boone bent down, slow and careful, and scooped her into his arms. She settled against him like she'd never belonged anywhere else. The judge exhaled, "That all I need to hear." And just like that, the trial was over. Not because Boone had convinced them he was a good man, but because a little girl believed it already. And sometimes, that was enough to make it true. The charges were dropped before the sun had even set. The judge packed up his papers, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and rode off the way he came, leaving behind a town that looked just a little different than it had the day before. Folks went back to their routines, but something had shifted. The saloon stayed open later, the whispers quieted, and more than one stranger noticed how Boone Maddox stood taller even when he didn't speak. Willa grew with the seasons, quick and wild like desert wind, soft like rain on old tin roofs. She learned to walk barefoot through the dust without flinching, to find her balance on fences and fallen logs. Boone taught her the things he knew, the weight of a saddle, the right way to hold a whittling knife, how to tell a harmless rattler from one that meant business. She soaked it all in, sharp-eyed and stubborn, asking questions until his patience ran dry, then asking more until he smiled in spite of himself. In the early mornings they read together. Boone's voice was slow, rough as gravel, but steady. She'd sit curled beside him on the porch steps, thumbing through dog-eared books, learning letters with her finger tracing the shape of each one. Sometimes he'd pause on a word, and she'd finish it for him, grinning wide. Those were the mornings he didn't even need coffee. They planted sunflowers along the saloon fence one spring, Boone digging deep into the soil, while Willa followed behind with a pouch of seeds. She named each one as she dropped it in, every last seed a promise. By late summer, they stretched tall and golden, swaying in the breeze like sentinels, turning their faces to the sky. Boone didn't soften. Not entirely. He still carried his gun, still chewed tobacco like it owed him money, still stared down drifters who looked too long at the girl he rocked to sleep each night. But there was something new in him now, something quieter. He built her a swing in the barn, patched her dresses himself when they tore, even learned how to braid her hair. Though his fingers were too big and clumsy for the job, she didn't seem to mind. As the years passed, stories began to spread. Travelers passing through Larkspur Bend would hear about the gunslinger who once brawled in every saloon from Tucson to Wichita, now seen humming lullabies beneath the stars. They'd catch sight of him carrying a sleepy girl in one arm, her head on his shoulder, her boots dangling, and wonder if they'd gotten the name wrong. Willa heard the whispers too, eventually. Heard kids talk behind her back, ask where her real parents were, why she didn't look like Boone. One evening, while they watched the sun fall behind the hills, she looked up at him and asked, "Was I ever unwanted?" Boone didn't flinch. He didn't reach for words he didn't have. He just set down his cup, pulled her close, and said, "You were left, baby girl, but never unloved." She leaned into his side, small and strong, and for a while they sat like that, father and daughter, not by blood but by choice, rooted in something stronger than name or law. Just two souls who had found each other in a world that hadn't known what to do with either one, and made a home out of it anyway. Thank you for watching. If you believe every soul deserves a second chance, show some love with a like and subscribe to stay with us for the next ride.